When Eleanor turned 65, she started noticing small changes. She'd walk into a room and forget why, or find herself pausing mid-sentence, searching for a word that used to come so easily. It wasn't frightening, just humbling. And it made her wonder, is this what getting older feels like? One afternoon, sitting by her garden window with a cup of chamomile tea, she whispered to herself, maybe I can't stop aging, but I can choose how I age. That small thought became the start of something beautiful. A quiet journey toward keeping her mind as alive, curious, and clear as her spirit, awakening the mind, dear 60. It began on a quiet Tuesday morning. Eleanor sat by the kitchen window, her hands wrapped around a warm cup of tea, watching the sunlight stretch across her garden. The house was still, too still, she thought. She tried to remember where she had placed her reading glasses. Were they on the counter? By the bedside? Or perhaps in the fridge again? She laughed softly at herself, but deep down, a small worry stirred. Forgetfulness had become a frequent guest lately. Little things, names, appointments, why she walked into a room, seemed to slip away more easily now. Her daughter called it senior moments. Her doctor called it normal aging. But to Eleanor, it felt like losing tiny pieces of herself, one memory at a time. She wasn't alone. Across the world, millions of people over 60 have felt that quiet unease. The fear that their sharpness, their wit, their confidence might fade with time. And yet, there was something in Eleanor that refused to surrender. Maybe it was curiosity, maybe it was pride, maybe it was love. For life, for learning, for still feeling alive. That morning she made a decision. Simple but powerful. If my mind is changing, and she whispered, then I will learn how to change with it. That moment marked the beginning of her second awakening. Not of youth, but of awareness. Because staying mentally sharp after 60 isn't about fighting age. It's about learning how to live with it. Wisely, gently, fully. The mind never stops growing. We tend to think of aging as decline, the slow fading of what once was. But the truth, whispered quietly by neuroscientists and storytellers alike, is this: the mind is more like a garden than a machine. Even in late life, the brain keeps growing, sprouting new connections, pruning old ones, adapting to change. It's a process called neuroplasticity, and it continues well into our 70s, 80s, and beyond. Lisa Feldman, a neuroscientist from Harvard, once said, aging does not mean the brain is breaking down. It means it's reorganizing, learning to thrive differently. Eleanor didn't know that term back then, but she could feel it, that spark of aliveness each time she tried something new, or solved a crossword puzzle, or found herself laughing at her own small mistakes. Each time she used her brain, she was quietly rewiring it, building strength, flexibility, and resilience. And just like that, her morning tea ritual became something deeper, a daily reminder that the mind, like the heart, could stay awake forever, if only we chose to keep it that way. The fear of losing it, aging, brings with it many gifts: patience, gratitude, wisdom, but it also carries an invisible fear, the fear of decline. For people like Eleanor, forgetting a word or misplacing keys can feel like a warning sign. But more often than not, it's simply the brain shifting its priorities, focusing less on speed and more on meaning. Researchers at Stanford found that as we age, our brains may slow down in processing new information, but they increase their ability to connect ideas, find patterns, and reflect deeply. So while youth is fast, age is profound. When Eleanor began to accept that her brain was not breaking, but changing, she found peace, and with peace came focus, and with focus came joy. Because staying sharp isn't about never forgetting. It's about remembering what truly matters. The awakening of attention. One afternoon, Eleanor decided to start something new: mindful awareness. Much to me, I bring us. She read about it in a magazine, how meditation and slow breathing could strengthen attention and memory. At first, it sounded too simple. Sit still, do nothing? How could that possibly sharpen her mind? But she tried it anyway. She closed her eyes, placed her hand on her chest, and took a deep breath. In, out, in, out. At first, her thoughts raced like wild horses. What to cook for dinner, when to call her sister, whether the mail had arrived. But as she kept breathing, a quiet clarity began to settle in. She noticed the sound of the birds outside, the warmth of sunlight on her face, the rhythm of her own heart. And for the first time in a long while, she wasn't chasing her thoughts. She was simply being with them. It felt like a kind of mental stillness, a space between moments where awareness could stretch and breathe. Later, she would learn that meditation increases gray matter density in the brain's hippocampus, the very region tied to memory and learning. But she didn't need the science to tell her it was working. She could feel it, rediscovering wonder. As weeks passed, something beautiful began to happen. Eleanor found herself more present, more alert, more alive. She began to notice small details she had long overlooked. The way the morning light touched the kitchen tiles, the laughter of her neighbor's grandchild, the scent of rain after a long, dry day. Every sensation, every sound, every color felt sharper, as if her senses had been gently polished by attention itself. And in those moments of noticing, her mind began to open again. Not to the past, but to now. It was in these small awakenings that Eleanor realized staying sharp isn't just about remembering facts. It's about remembering life, a gentle shift. There was no magic switch, no sudden transformation, just small, steady steps. Curiosity, patience, awareness. Her days became a balance of learning and letting go. Learning what nourished her mind, letting go of what cluttered it. She began journaling her thoughts, reading short articles on neuroscience, even taking up an online art class for seniors. Every new brushstroke felt like a message from her younger self. See, you're still growing. By the time spring arrived, Eleanor no longer feared the small forgettings. They were part of the rhythm, the natural give and take of a brain that had carried her through decades of laughter, love, and loss. Her focus had changed. She wasn't trying to preserve who she was. She was discovering who she could still become. The beauty of a growing mind. By 68, Eleanor often said something that her friends would repeat later. Aging doesn't take away your sharpness. It just teaches you where to point it. She learned that attention, curiosity, and kindness were the true nutrients of the mind. And each day, she practiced feeding them. She no longer tried to be quick. She tried to be clear. She no longer tried to know everything. She tried to understand deeply. And in that shift, her mind didn't fade. It flourished. Because the truth about staying mentally sharp after 60 isn't found in supplements or memory games. It's found in a way of living, a way of paying attention, of engaging with curiosity, of loving what is still unfolding. Eleanor's awakening was not loud. It was quiet, a whisper beneath the noise of ordinary days. But from that whisper grew strength, clarity, and calm. A reminder that no matter our age, the mind's greatest power lies not in remembering everything, but in remembering to stay awake to life. 2. The science of staying sharp. Eleanor's mornings slowly turned into small rituals of curiosity. She'd start her day with a walk around the block, noticing the crisp air against her skin, the way the sun filtered through oak leaves. She began to carry a small notebook in her pocket, not for lists or reminders, but for questions. Why do we dream, she once wrote. Why does music make me remember things so vividly? She didn't know it then, but she was already exercising one of the most powerful muscles of the brain. Curiosity, the brain that never retires. For most of our lives, we're told that the brain slows down as we age. It's true in some ways. Processing speed, multitasking, and recall might take a little longer. But beneath that slower rhythm lies something extraordinary, a more connected brain. Neuroscientists at the University of California found that older adults often have stronger connections between the left and right hemispheres of the brain, allowing for deeper insight, creativity, and emotional understanding. So while younger brains are fast and reactive, aging brains are wise and integrative. They see patterns that others might miss. They find meaning in what others overlook. Dr. Daniel Levitine, author of Successful Aging, puts it beautifully. The aging brain is not broken. It's just tuned differently, like a well-worn violin that plays with richer tone. Eleanor had never read his book, but she felt that truth. Her thoughts weren't as quick as they once were, but they ran deeper. When she spoke, she paused more, not because she forgot, but because she cared to choose her words well. The role of neuroplasticity. One afternoon while scrolling online, she came across a term, neuroplasticity. The word sounded complicated, but the meaning was simple. The brain can change and grow at any age, depending on how we use it. Every time she tried something new, every time she learned a song, every time she took a different route on her walk, her brain was rewiring itself. Neurons, those tiny messengers of thought, were forming new pathways. Connections were strengthening, like roots spreading in fertile soil. The old belief that you can't teach an old dog new tricks had long been proven wrong. In truth, the older the brain, the more potential it has for wisdom and adaptability, as long as it stays active, challenged, and engaged. So Eleanor made a quiet vow to herself. Every day I will do at least one small thing my brain isn't expecting. Some days it was switching her toothbrush hand. Other days it was learning a few Spanish words from her neighbor. It wasn't about mastery, it was about movement. Because in the brain, movement means life. The dopamine secret. One of the unsung heroes of brain health is dopamine, the motivation molecule. It's what gives us a sense of pleasure, anticipation, and curiosity. When we stop learning new things or feeling challenged, dopamine levels decline, and so does enthusiasm. But when we reintroduce novelty, a new hobby, a small adventure, even a fresh conversation, dopamine flows again. That's why Eleanor felt so alive each time she tried something new. Her mind wasn't just remembering, it was rewarding itself. Dr. Andrew Huberman, a neuroscientist from Stanford, once said, "Novelty is nature's way of keeping the brain young." Eleanor smiled when she read that quote in a podcast transcript, because by then, she had already proven it true. Every time she sat at her piano to learn a new song, every time she opened a new book, she could almost feel her brain light up, like a home coming alive after dark, one room at a time. Sleep, memory, and the gentle repair. But curiosity alone wasn't enough. There was another piece to the puzzle: rest. For years, Eleanor had struggled with sleep. Some nights she lay awake replaying memories. Other nights, her mind simply refused to quiet. One morning, after a particularly restless night, she decided to learn why sleep mattered so much. She discovered something astonishing. During deep sleep, the brain actually cleans itself. Inside our heads, a system called the glymphatic system flushes out toxins that build up during the day, including those linked to memory loss and cognitive decline. In other words, good sleep wasn't just rest, it was brain maintenance. So Eleanor began treating sleep not as a luxury, but as an act of care. She created a bedtime ritual: herbal tea, gentle stretching, no screens after sunset. Within weeks, she began to feel the difference. Her thoughts were clearer, her memory sharper, and her mornings as peaceful again. Feeding the brain. Eleanor also began to rethink what she ate. Her doctor once told her, "What's good for the heart is good for the brain." She smiled and took that to heart, literally. Blueberries for antioxidants, walnuts for omega-3s, olive oil, green tea, and dark chocolate, her new trio of delights. She didn't chase miracle diets or supplements. Instead, she focused on nourishment. Simple, colorful, mindful. Science agreed. Studies showed that people who follow the Mediterranean diet, rich in fruits, vegetables, whole grains, and fish, have a lower risk of cognitive decline. Eleanor began calling it her brain garden. Each meal, she'd say, was planting seeds of clarity. The emotional brain. But staying mentally sharp wasn't just about neurons and nutrients. It was also about emotions, the invisible threads that connect the mind and the heart. Chronic stress, sadness, or loneliness could dim the mind's light faster than age itself. When cortisol, the stress hormone, stays high for too long, it can damage the hippocampus, the brain's memory center. So Eleanor learned the art of calming herself. She practiced gratitude before sleep, forgiveness when old regrets surfaced, and laughter, always laughter, because a joyful brain is a resilient brain. Science meets spirit. One evening, she sat on her porch as the sunset painted the sky in soft pink. She thought of how far she'd come, not by resisting time, but by learning to work with it. Her mind was no longer something to keep young, but something to keep alive. She realized that the science of staying sharp was not separate from the art of living well. It was all connected. The sleep she tended to, the meals she enjoyed, the thoughts she nurtured, and the emotions she allowed herself to feel. She was no longer afraid of losing her mind. She was in awe of how beautifully it adapted. Eleanor's journey wasn't about becoming who she once was. It was about becoming more awake to who she had become. Her curiosity was her compass, her habits, her tools, and her gratitude, her medicine. In understanding her brain, she had learned the most human truth of all. The mind stays sharp when it keeps falling in love with learning. 3. The daily habits of a clear mind. Mornings had become Eleanor's favorite time of day. Before the noise of the world seeped in, there was quiet, a kind of sacred silence that belonged only to her. Her mornings weren't about rushing anymore. They were about anchoring. She'd open the blinds, let the light pour in, and whisper to herself, "Another day to stay curious." It wasn't a mantra, just a gentle reminder that clarity didn't arrive by chance. It was built slowly, through the habits she chose each day. The power of a morning routine. Eleanor used to think routines were dull, something that stole spontaneity. But as she grew older, she realized the opposite was true. A steady routine wasn't about restriction, it was about freedom. Each morning, she started with a glass of water and a few stretches by the window. Her body wasn't as flexible as before, but movement, even slow movement, woke her mind. Research from Harvard Medical School confirmed it. Even 20 minutes of light exercise can increase blood flow to the brain, boost mood, and improve memory. Eleanor didn't need a study to tell her that, though. She felt it. After each small stretch or short walk, her thoughts became clearer, as if the fog had lifted, revealing the calm beneath. Then came breakfast. Simple, colorful, and mindful. Oatmeal with berries, green tea with lemon, sometimes a slice of whole grain toast with almond butter. Each bite felt like she was fueling her mind, not just feeding her body, and as she sat by the window, she'd write one thought of gratitude in her notebook. Sometimes it was deep. "I'm thankful for my daughter's laughter." Sometimes it was simple. "The sky looks kind today." But every entry, she believed, kept her brain awake to the beauty of ordinary life. Reading as mental exercise, Eleanor had always loved books. But after 60, reading became more than a hobby. It was a daily exercise for her brain, a way to keep the mental muscles stretching and flexing. She didn't rush through chapters like she did in her younger years. Now she read slowly, savoring the rhythm of each sentence, pausing when something touched her heart. Sometimes she'd read aloud, just to hear the music of words again. It helped her memory, her pronunciation, and even her mood. Studies from Yale University had found that older adults who read regularly lived, on average, 2 years longer than those who didn't. Not because of magic, but because reading stimulates empathy, imagination, and complex thinking, all vital to brain health. When she read, Eleanor wasn't just learning, she was traveling to new places, new times, new hearts. And in doing so, her mind never stopped expanding. The brain gym of curiosity. Each day, Eleanor gave herself small challenges. Her own little brain gym. She'd do crosswords or Sudoku in the newspaper, play word games with friends online, or memorize short poems to recite at her community club. But her favorite brain exercise was learning songs on her old piano. At first, it was frustrating. Her fingers stumbled, her memory lagged. But then, slowly, the melody returned. The music reawakened something in her that went beyond cognition. Music, she learned, was one of the most powerful tools for keeping the mind sharp. It activates nearly every region of the brain, especially those tied to memory, attention, and emotion. When Eleanor played, she wasn't just practicing notes, she was building neural pathways. And when her neighbors heard her soft tunes drifting through the window, they often smiled, knowing she was out there. Still learning, still glowing. The gift of connection. One of the greatest lessons Eleanor learned was that mental sharpness doesn't live in isolation. It thrives in connection. After her husband passed, there were years of quiet, too much quiet. She had conversations with her cat, her plants, even the radio, but deep down she knew what her brain and her heart truly needed was people. So she joined a local community center. At first, she sat quietly in the back of art classes, painting simple flowers. Then she started talking to others, sharing stories, laughter, recipes. Over time, those small exchanges became lifelines of energy. Studies show that strong social bonds can reduce the risk of dementia by nearly 45%. Not because talking alone changes the brain, but because feeling seen does. When we connect, the brain releases oxytocin, a hormone that softens fear and boosts clarity. Conversation, it turns out, is another kind of mental exercise, one rooted in love and presence. Eleanor found that every story shared was a spark, a light that kept her mind awake and her spirit alive. The joy of learning something new. One day, Eleanor decided to sign up for a pottery class. She had never worked with clay before. Her hands trembled a little, and her instructor smiled gently. "Don't worry," he said. "It's not about perfection, it's about feeling the form." As the clay spun beneath her fingers, she felt something ancient and simple, a connection between her body, her breath, and her focus. It wasn't easy, but every mistake was a small victory. Every wobble, a lesson in patience. That's when she realized something profound. Learning after 60 wasn't about becoming good at something. It was about becoming open again. Each time she stepped into something new, painting, music, gardening, writing, her mind stretched a little more, like light through an open window. Dr. Norman Doidge, author of The Brain That Changes Itself, wrote, "Every time you learn something new, your brain builds a new self." Eleanor smiled when she read that quote in her journal one night, because that's exactly how she felt. New, growing, alive. Ending the day with intention. As the day came to a close, Eleanor would sit quietly by her bedside lamp. She'd write 3 sentences in her journal, not of plans but of reflections. What did I notice today? What did I learn? What made me smile? Those small acts of reflection didn't just calm her mind, they organized it. It was her way of telling her brain, "You can rest now. We've done well today." Then she'd close her notebook and whisper, "Thank you, mind, for staying with me." And with that, she'd drift into sleep, knowing that the clarity she carried wasn't the absence of fog, but the presence of light. Eleanor's habits weren't grand or complicated. They were simple, but sacred. A morning walk, a curious question, a new melody, a shared smile, a quiet reflection. Day by day, they shaped her mind, not into something younger, but into something wiser, steadier, and deeply alive. Because staying sharp after 60 isn't a battle, it's a rhythm, a dance between awareness and rest, curiosity and calm. And for Eleanor, that dance had become the most beautiful part of growing older. 4. The emotional side of mental strength. There are many ways to keep the mind strong, through puzzles, reading, or learning something new. But Eleanor had come to understand something more subtle. The sharpest minds are not only active, they are peaceful, because a restless heart clouds the clearest thoughts, while a calm one opens the door to focus, memory, and joy. When emotions fog the mind. There was a time when Eleanor carried too many memories that weighed her down. Old regrets, arguments that had no closure, dreams that never came true. She never spoke about them out loud, but they lived quietly in her chest, and sometimes they echoed in her thoughts. One evening, while trying to remember a grocery list, she caught herself drifting into old sadness instead. It wasn't the memory of what she needed, it was the memory of what she missed. That's when she began to realize her forgetfulness wasn't always about her brain. Sometimes it was about her heart. Emotional clutter, like physical clutter, can block clarity, and holding on to pain consumes mental energy that could be used for creativity, learning, and joy. The heart-brain connection. Eleanor's doctor once told her something that stuck. Every emotion you feel travels through your entire body, including your brain. When we're anxious or angry, cortisol, the stress hormone, floods our system, narrowing focus and impairing memory. But when we feel gratitude, love, or peace, another hormone, oxytocin, rises, soothing the nervous system and opening mental clarity. Scientists call it the heart-brain connection. It's not poetry, it's biology. Dr. Roland McCready from the HeartMath Institute discovered that when people feel appreciation or compassion, their heart rhythms become more stable and coherent. And this harmony improves brain function. In other words, a calm heart creates a clear mind. The healing power of forgiveness. Forgiveness was one of the hardest lessons Eleanor had to learn. There were people she hadn't spoken to in years, a friend she'd lost touch with after a misunderstanding, moments she wished she had handled differently. For decades, she carried them like invisible stones in her pocket. One afternoon, she sat down at her writing desk and began to write letters, not to send, but to release. Letter by letter, she let the old anger and guilt pour out. By the end of the last one, her tears had turned into a soft, quiet smile. Forgiveness didn't change the past, but it lightened her mind. She slept better that night, and in the morning she noticed how easily her thoughts flowed, how light her chest felt, how clearly she could recall details again. It was as if letting go had unclogged the pipes of her memory. Researchers from Stanford University later confirmed that people who practice forgiveness have lower stress levels, improved sleep, and even stronger cognitive performance. Eleanor didn't need the study to believe it. She had lived it. The grace of gratitude. Each morning before breakfast, Eleanor opened her small journal, her book of bright things. Inside were pages filled with tiny moments she didn't want to forget. The smell of her grandson's hair after a bath, the way sunlight touched her curtains, a neighbor's unexpected kindness. It wasn't just sentimental, it was scientific. Gratitude activates the brain's reward centers, boosts serotonin, and helps balance mood. It literally rewires the brain to look for goodness, and in doing so, strengthens neural pathways tied to optimism and focus. The more thankful Eleanor became, the more aware she grew of life's details. And awareness, she realized, was the foundation of mental sharpness. Gratitude keeps my mind awake to what's good, she often said, and when I focus on what's good, everything feels clearer. The power of meaning. After her husband's passing, Eleanor often asked herself, "What is my purpose now?" That question haunted many of her friends too. They had worked, raised families, lived full lives, and then suddenly, the structure of purpose disappeared. Without meaning, the mind can drift, not because it's weak, but because it's searching. Eleanor began volunteering at the library, reading stories to children on Saturday mornings. At first it felt small, but every smile, every curious pair of eyes listening to her voice gave her something back, a sense of belonging, of being needed. Purpose doesn't have to be grand, she learned. It just has to make you feel alive. Studies from the Rush Memory and Aging Project showed that older adults with a strong sense of purpose have a 30% lower risk of cognitive decline. Because meaning doesn't just lift the spirit, it sharpens the mind. Emotional hygiene. Eleanor started treating her emotions the same way she treated her home, with gentle maintenance. When sadness came, she didn't push it away. She gave it space, like an old friend passing through. When worry appeared, she walked with it, then let it fade. And when joy arrived, she welcomed it fully. She learned that emotional strength isn't about controlling feelings. It's about allowing them, then letting them go. Each evening, she'd take 5 quiet minutes to breathe and name what she felt that day. Grateful, tired, peaceful, uncertain. Naming emotions, psychologists say, reduces their intensity and helps the brain process them better. It's a small act, but one that keeps the emotional mind from turning fog into storms. Conversations of the heart. One Sunday, during her weekly coffee with friends, Eleanor shared something she'd learned. "When I talk about how I feel," she said, "I remember better. It's as if my thoughts become clearer once they're spoken." Her friend nodded. It turns out Eleanor was right. Talking through emotions activates both language and memory regions in the brain. strengthening mental pathways and emotional understanding. That's why meaningful conversations, not gossip or small talk, but genuine connection, are like nourishment for the brain. So each Sunday, their coffee meetups turned into heart sessions. Laughter, stories, sometimes tears. And every time they left, they felt lighter, sharper, and a little more human. Eleanor used to think staying mentally sharp was about what she did, but she came to realize it was also about what she felt. A clear mind grows in a peaceful heart, and emotional wisdom, forgiveness, gratitude, purpose, was not just nourishment for the soul, but medicine for the brain. Because when the heart is steady, the mind can see clearly. And when the mind is clear, life, even at 60, 70, or 80, feels beautifully alive. 5. The freedom of a curious life. On a bright spring morning, Eleanor stood by her window, watching sunlight spill across her garden. The lavender she planted last year had started to bloom, and for a moment she simply smiled. She wasn't thinking about the past or worrying about tomorrow. Her mind was quiet, steady, and open, like the morning sky. And in that stillness, she realized something profound. Staying mentally sharp wasn't about holding on. It was about staying curious. The mind that keeps asking, why? Eleanor had always loved learning. As a girl, she would take apart her father's clock just to see how it worked. Now at 70, she found herself doing the same thing. Not with clocks, but with life. When she saw a new kind of bird at her feeder, she looked it up. When her grandson mentioned artificial intelligence, she asked what it meant. When her neighbor played a strange song from the 1970s, she listened, really listened, trying to understand why it moved people. Each new curiosity sparked a gentle fire in her brain. Neurologists say that curiosity releases dopamine, the same chemical tied to motivation and learning. It creates a reward loop, training the brain to keep exploring, to stay awake to the world. Eleanor didn't read that in a science journal. She felt it every time she asked a new question and felt that quiet thrill of discovery. Learning not to impress, but to feel alive. One of Eleanor's favorite new habits was joining an online art class. Every Thursday afternoon, she sat in front of her laptop, paintbrush trembling slightly in her hand. The first few classes were messy, her colors ran wild, her perspective off. But she laughed through it. It wasn't about being good, it was about being engaged. Dr. Denise Park, a neuroscientist at the University of Texas, discovered that learning complex skills in later life, like digital photography or painting, stimulates neural growth and memory. In other words, every new skill was like planting another tree in the forest of the mind. Eleanor smiled when she heard that. She liked the idea of her mind as a garden, always growing, always blooming. Connection keeps curiosity alive. Eleanor's curiosity didn't live in isolation. It thrived through people. She began hosting a small, curious circle in her neighborhood, a group of retirees who met once a week to share something new they'd learned. Sometimes it was a story, sometimes a recipe, and sometimes just a question that had no clear answer. Those meetings filled the room with laughter, ideas, and warmth. It reminded her that curiosity is contagious. When one person wonders, others wake up too. The group grew closer, their conversations weaving into a living web of shared discovery. And more importantly, none of them ever felt old in that room. The Science of a Curious Mind studies from the University of California, Davis showed that curiosity increases activity in the hippocampus, the part of the brain responsible for forming memories. When you're curious, you not only learn better, you remember better. That's why Eleanor's new experiences felt so vivid. She could recall the name of the bird she'd learned last week, the ingredients of a new soup recipe, even the poem her friend read during coffee. Her mind wasn't slowing down. It was adapting, growing, living. Curiosity, she realized, is the brain's way of staying young. The joy of not knowing one evening, Eleanor sat with her granddaughter Lucy, watching the stars. Lucy asked, "Grandma, do you know all the constellations?" Eleanor laughed softly. "Oh no, sweetheart. I don't even know half of them. Doesn't that bother you? The girl asked. Not at all, Eleanor said, smiling, because it means there's still something left to learn. Lucy thought for a moment, then whispered, That's kind of cool. Eleanor nodded. It is. The world's too big to ever stop wondering, and in that moment, both of them, the old woman and the little girl, looked up at the same night sky, two minds wide open, connected by curiosity. The freedom of the curious heart. As years passed, Eleanor's steps grew slower, but her mind felt lighter, freer than ever. Curiosity had given her more than knowledge. It had given her joy, because a curious heart doesn't dwell on what's lost, it delights in what's yet to be discovered. It doesn't fear change. It welcomes it as a new chapter waiting to be explored. And in that freedom there is youth, not in years but in spirit. To stay young, she once told her friends, is to never stop saying wow. Final reflection. At 72, Eleanor no longer worried about staying sharp. She simply lived with wonder, and her mind followed. She found that mental clarity wasn't a fight against aging, it was an embrace of life itself. To stay sharp, to stay curious, to stay alive, they were all the same thing. And so, each morning, when she opened her eyes, Eleanor whispered the same simple words that had become her mantra. Thank you for another day to learn.